Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of In the Artist Studio. My name is Nicole Winthrop, and I'm the membership manager here at Museum of the African Diaspora, San Francisco. This series was made possible by generous donations from the Westridge Foundation, Art Bridges Foundation, MoAD members, and viewers like you. I'd also like to let you know we've kickstarted our year end, and as 2020 comes to a close, and with $700,000 remaining to raise, we ask for your support of our Future Forward annual fund. You can go to donate.moadsf.org to learn more. While MoAD's physical building may be closed due to the mandatory shelter in place, you can still get your fill of art and artists of the African diaspora. Each Wednesday at 1:00 p.m. Pacific time, you join MoAD staff members as we visit some of our favorite artists in their studios for a rare opportunity to hear from the artists themselves and learn how their work is changing as a result of the quarantine. Please visit our archive of past talks on MoAD's YouTube channel. On behalf of the MoAD board and staff, I'd like to now take a moment to hold space for those whose lives have been lost at the hands of police brutality and systemic racism here and throughout the world. I'd like to say their names: Tamir Rice, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Walter Wallace Jr. On behalf of the MoAD board and staff, I'd also like to acknowledge the indigenous peoples who have stewarded the land we are located. In today's program, Senior Director of Education, Dimitri Broxton, will speak with artist Roberto Lugo. Dimitri, an Oakland native, has over 18 years of experience working in the field of education and the arts. At MoAD, he leads the education programs that enhance the visitor experience at the museum. His department's mission is to connect youth, educators, and the public to the historical, cultural, and intellectual contributions of the worldwide African diaspora. Outside of his role at MoAD, Dimitri is an independent curator and practicing artist and has served as a curator for the city of Berkeley. Roberto Lugo is an American artist, ceramicist, social activist, poet, and educator. Lugo uses porcelain as his medium of choice, illuminating its aristocratic surface with imagery of poverty, inequality, and social and racial injustice. Lugo's works are multicultural mashups, traditional European and Asian porcelain forms, and techniques reimagined with a 21st century street sensibility. Lugo is the recipient of the 2019 Rome Prize and was awarded a 2019 Pew Fellowship. His work is represented in the permanent collections of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Philadelphia Museum of Art, High Museum of Art, Brooklyn Museum, the Walters Museum of Art, and more. Let's meet Dimitri and Roberto in the art studio.
Thanks, Nicole. I really appreciate that. And before we get started, I just want to acknowledge our mutual friend, Adam Wallace, who made this connection. Yeah. So Adam, I hope you're out there, and thank you so much. I really appreciate you.
Man, I love autumn.
Yeah, how are you doing, and where are you joining us from?
So I'm joining you from Glenside, Pennsylvania. It's a little bit outside of Philadelphia by about 2 blocks or so. Yeah, it just started snowing outside. So it's a new day, a new challenge, in the year 2020. So
I hear that now. You're really stuck inside. Yeah. I don't know. That's kind of rough. As an artist, and even before I go in there, I just have to say I'm really excited. I saw when you got the Emerging Artist Award and you did that speech, and I think that's when was it the NCE? I'm gonna mess up the acronym.
They call it NCECA.
NCECA. And I think that's where so many people learned about you. And I just have to say, you absolutely blew my mind. And I was like, oh wow, there's, as an artist, and I think other folks who are on their journey as an artist, you find certain people that let you know that your way of thinking is possible and that you can be a legit artist and do your thing. And so before we go on, I just want to acknowledge that, and I want to thank you for how inspiring you have been to so many folks, because art is so elite, and I think you have had this magical way of tearing down the walls and making your work accessible to everyone. And I can't wait to dive into it. And if folks don't know your work, introduce them to it. But yeah, so I just want to start off with that.
That's amazing to hear. One of the things I tell people about that experience. So a few years ago, what Dimitri's referring to is I gave a lecture at NCECA. It was emerging artists, and so this emerging artists award is it's meant for early career to mid career artists who are making an impact or doing something special. It's considered one of the higher end awards that they give in the field of ceramics. However, that same year I got declined for every student show that I applied to, just about everything that I applied to that year related to ceramics. And what it reminded me of was how many folks out there with voices like mine who are not accepted and are not included in a lot of these conversations. And it's almost like what I try to tell people is, if you're impressed by me, there's a lot more voices out there, a lot more people that we just need to give opportunities to. And that's partially, in large part, what my career is dedicated to as an educator and artist.
I hear that. And I know all the all the folks that rejected you at the time are kicking themselves. They're like, why did I do that? I missed opportunity. It was their bad. So yeah, I just kind of want to know, before we go into that, the kind of the starting question, I think, to all of these, we started this program during at the beginning of the pandemic, and we saw the Black Lives Matter movement go from this fringe group that was kind of underground, that didn't really catch on the national stage level, and we quickly we saw the movement go to the center stage. We also saw it not just go center stage nationally, but internationally. How has any of that, quarantine, sheltering in place, Black Lives Matter movement, has that shifted your work in any kind of way?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in many ways it's made me feel validated as a person and as an artist. A lot of my fears validated. I think what winds up happening with a lot of white America, I can't speak for other countries because I don't really know them that well, but one of the things that happens is, I think often people don't think that they have racist tendencies, or they think they're living an anti-racist life. However, their experience being around people of color and specifically Black and brown people, and the obstacles that we have to go through, like when an example is when I first met my partner and we were dating. I explained to her when we were driving that, hey, I get pulled over pretty often, being a brown bearded man in at the time we were living in a very sort of like red part of the country. And she's like, oh yeah, like, that's just a stereotype. I don't, like, whatever. And then, after the first time, she could like let it pass. And then, the fourth or fifth time I was pulled over by police, she started like fighting with the police. And, as a white person, she was able to say a lot of things that I wasn't, and I was kind of like, hey, you better dial it down because you're going to get me shot over like what you're saying, So it's like, well, what ended up happening with a lot of the movement in the last year is, I think people didn't have a choice to ignore it. They were like home and they had to watch it and they had to live with themselves. And it became a fire under a lot of people where they were just like, why does this still exist in the year 2020? And why am I okay with this? And I think it also validated a lot of people who have been talking about this for years. Like, I had a piece with Colin Kaepernick years ago, and the way that I framed the piece was I had Colin Kaepernick on one side of the object, and I had John Brown on the other side. And the idea that I was trying to say is that at the time Colin Kaepernick was a really divisive figure, meaning if you brought him up, you were either Republican or Democrat on one side or another. And John Brown in his day was also a really divisive figure, being a white person who was anti-slavery. And, when we look at John Brown now, I would hope that most human beings will look at him and say, that's not a divisive figure. Anybody who's anti-slavery, is at least somewhat on the right side of history. And so I believe the same about Colin Kaepernick, really making a sacrifice and sacrificing his career, to be frank. And what's interesting is since, this last year, that pot has taken on an entirely different meaning, because a lot of people who are anti Colin Kaepernick, like the NFL, the NBA, who make so much money off of, Black Americans. And they were forced to say, look, we agree with this. Black Lives Matter. And it's the most obvious thing for me became the fact that it is so difficult for a part of our society just to say those words. Like it is, it's unimaginable that is a question of whether or not Black Lives Matter. So for me as an artist, it's made me feel validated to continue to foster opportunities for other artists, and feel empowered to continue to pay homage to the Black and brown people that I put on my pottery.
I love it. I love it. I also want to say, like Nicole said, you were awarded the Rome Prize, and that's huge, huge. What happened with that? I remember seeing, and Hyperallergic, I want to say, when the announcement came out, and that also corresponded with the start of the pandemic. Did that still continue to happen? I know you were going to do a large project in Paris with that, or did that get pushed off?
Yeah, so yes, it winded up getting pushed off. I winded up prior to getting this Rome Prize, I applied just on a whim, which is like what I tell a lot of artists is, apply for the things that you don't even think you're qualified for, because everybody else who's applying is probably in the same position. They just followed through with applying. And I get this interview and they wanted to fly me out to New York, and they have like the head of architecture at Harvard and all these like really, scholars and just really brilliant people interviewing you as an artist. And so it's very intimidating. And I lost my internet, and I winded up doing the whole interview in Starbucks. And the man next to me he was a white man who was really next to me. There was a man next to him who was talking on Zoom and communicating. But when I started doing it, he got really pissed off and actually berated me in front of the committee. So I had to like a meeting, and it was this thing where like, I think partially them seeing me have to go through that in the middle of the interview spoke volumes to them in terms of like how I dealt with that situation. So I got this wonderful opportunity to go to Rome for 6 months, and it took a lot to talk my partner into it because we have kids. We have 2 children, but we actually winded up moving out of our home, and we went to Italy, and then 2 weeks in, we got shut down from the pandemic, and we winded up 2 weeks later being sent home. And so, I spent all the money I had getting a kiln and a wheel, my whole family up there, and then and planning on being supported for 6 months and then losing all those things. And then we winded up living in about eight B&Bs,
Wow.
Airbnb when we came back before we were able to find a permanent home. Um, and, you know, that whole time it was really depressing as an artist. And I would say probably in about June or July, um, when I started to see all this movement being made, you know, it told me that I don't have the time to just sit back. I have to participate in every way that I can. And being somebody who's a diabetic, who has a lot of pre-existing conditions um, that are genetic for me, and having all those things, I said, well, I can't go out and physically protest. I have to think about my kids, you know. So I said, you know, what's my way of protesting? I'm going to use social media. I'm going to make my work. I'm going to support financially all these organizations that have been making progress. And so as an artist, it's reinvigorated me in a much different way. It's made me feel as if I'm part of a movement and less on my own trying to communicate. You know, like I can be a village potter for the Black Lives Matter movement, and I don't have to be the speaker. I can just be someone in the background helping in this way. And so it's just really amazing to see people, not just in America, but people all over the world getting behind this and saying, you know, we're gonna stop everything until this stops, until we put an end to this. And so I'm just really proud of all the people and all the work that's been done this year. It's been really profound to see.
That is awesome. And I mean, wow, that I had no idea that that's what happened to you. I'd hoped that the cancellation of that residency would have happened before the pandemic. But I just have to say, seeing the work that you created, you know, since then is just so inspiring. I can't believe that you went through all of that with your family, and still, I mean, your work is phenomenal. And kind of with that said, I want to jump into some of the work. I have some questions that I want to ask you about, you know, your background while I do that. But you know, I think 20 minutes into this program, I want people to see what you do.
Yeah.
So just give me a second to pull this up. My screens are being weird today. Oh my goodness, what is going on? Sorry, y'all. I will be with you in just a second on this.
No, you good. So this particular piece, this is one of my earlier century vases. And what I mean when I say century vase is in 1876, the World's Fair, America had a booth and they were trying to identify what it means to be American. And so they had all these iconic images of America, like the creation of the sewing machine, in their view, this sort of like image of trade between indigenous people and, you know, colonizers, essentially. And so it was sort of this exploration, and it had George Washington on the center of it, and it had all these animals gilding it. And so I've been kind of like using this form, this shape, to talk about a century of certain topics. And so the first couple were less topical. They were more just sort of like they were sort of just like images of what I sort of like wish was on the original century vase, but then also sharing like the complicated history of what a lot of the people that I'm putting on here had to go through. So like has Frederick Douglass and Cornel West. Forgive me, this is like something I made, I think 8 years ago.
I think so.
Then members of the Wu-Tang Clan at the bottom.
Yeah, I definitely I wanted to kind of start back further in your development as an artist. And so I think also putting something like this you're from Philly.
Mhm.
And how did you, what was your path to becoming a ceramicist, and what was your path into choosing porcelain? And I just have so many questions about your origin story within this field.
Sure,
What opened
sure.
that up for you?
So I mean, my story is not, unfortunately, not that uncommon. I grew up in a really poor neighborhood in Philadelphia, and there was a lot of situations where we had rundown housing, no water, no electricity, um, and the sort of the setup for us was quite different than what I've experienced in my adult life, seeing other people and how they grew up. Like, for example, as a man, in my family, we were not encouraged to go to high school. That was sort of like our version of college. And so most of the men in my family finished school in middle school, including my father and my brother. And so the idea of going to college really never occurred to me. And it wasn't something we talked about in high school, and we didn't have to write papers. And
Hmm.
so I found myself, in my early 20s, and, I have all these cousins, um, 57 cousins, and all the men were incarcerated at some point. Most of them were incarcerated at this point in my life. And I saw myself going down the same path. I was like, I could work a whole week at this factory that I was working at since I was 13, and I could make that same money in like 2 hours on the corner, and then have the rest of
Mm-hmm.
the week to myself. And then I could have the rims I want, and I can have the shoes I want. So I started to have all these ideas, and I said to myself, you know what? I got an aunt that lives in Florida. I just want to try something different. So I asked if I could move out there, and I did. I got me a little job, and I found out that the community college over there was like $300 a class. And so I wanted to go to school to meet people about my age, but I didn't want to have to go for anything. I didn't know what I wanted to do yet. There wasn't anybody around me who was going to college or pushing for anything. And so I decided to take an art class, and it was a drawing class because I figured, I grew up doing graffiti, and there's some kind of connection for me there. And then also, there'll be like less writing. That was sort of my mental state. And the teacher wanted to be a potter, and I noticed that all the time there was always people in the pottery studio.
Okay.
And because it was like a need for community there. And so I wound up taking a pottery class, and it was it was a very strange experience because, when I sat down on the wheel, there's sort of like this, um, like inferiority complex that comes from growing up where I did. And the whole time I'm in there enjoying myself and making pots, and I'm kind of like thinking that somebody's gonna come in the room at any point and say like, hey, what are you doing here?
Mm.
Excuse me, like, you're not supposed to be here. And it just sort of felt like I was doing something I wasn't supposed to, and it was kind of felt sweet in that way. And in some ways, I kind of felt like an ethnographer because I was like around a group of white people in a class setting for the first time in my life. And I was really like watching and listening to a lot of their conversations. And there was things like people were making teapots, and I was like, man, how much tea are white people drinking? Like, we don't drink tea at home. So there was just like so many things that were culturally like contrast to how I experienced growing up. And so when I saw the potters wheel, I saw it as a machine that makes round things.
Mm-hmm.
So I like one of the first things I made was a ceramic fire hydrant because when and it was a soap dispenser because when the water gets shut off when I was a kid, me and my dad would shower in the fire hydrant. So it's like that was immediately what my intuition was. And so I decided I really wanted to pursue this. So I went to undergraduate at the Kansas City Art Institute. And it was a hustle to get there. Like, I bought a kiln on Craigslist, and I used to move my parents' stove out of their kitchen and then lift up a whole kiln and put it in the kitchen and plug it in.
Wow.
One day my back actually ripped on me and I was out of commission for 3 months, but that's how I got my portfolio together. And I had this idea, I wanted to be a production potter and I wanted to bring pottery to people of color. I wanted to bring pottery to people that come from where I came from. And when I went to college, it was a very difficult experience because it was, I was personally aware that a lot of times I was the only person of color in the room, but it sort of like took over every conversation and it became really difficult to just be like my general self, like everywhere I went in the college, it's about 700 students. Every building I entered, people would constantly ask me for my ID. Like, can I see your picture? Can I see, make sure you're a student here? And then people would just like frame things in a really strange way. Like in one of my wife's classes, they called me a Mexican gangster. And, there was all these like things that would come and critique that people just like didn't even understand why it was racist. And you being the only person of color, you sort of feel like the race police, because you're just like, did you really just say that? Like I can't believe this is happening. And so after a while, it really made this point of like, I was trying to make friends so much and I couldn't. And so I really had to like separate myself and it became lonely. And I went once to the library and I saw this book of Worcester porcelain. And when I saw it, I said to myself, that teapot on there looks really expensive, and I said, wouldn't it be interesting if I made things that looked precious and expensive? And then I did something to them to make them more unique to my experience. And so I started to see all these vignettes and they would copy a lot of Chinese patterns and images. And so on a couple of the teapots, I saw portraits of like royalty. And, for a little while, because there was a lot of commentary on my looks at school, like people would constantly say that I look like CeeLo, CeeLo Green, and you get that enough and you're just like really self-conscious. And so I started to actually put my face on my pottery. And the idea was like put my face in a place that doesn't belong. And then after a while, it kind of seemed like I was full of myself. And so I was like, well, if I'm doing royalty here, why don't I do like my form of royalty? And so that started off with Harriet Tubman, because when I was a kid, that was one of the first, when I was in elementary school, one of the first like books that I read on my own was like these children's books that they had on Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. And I started like, those people became like superheroes to me as a kid, because it was like, look, what they overcame. It was like so much more real than like a Superman or a Spider-Man. It was just like, like Harriet Tubman did this for real, not just like without the superpowers, but she was superhuman, And so I really wanted to like honor her. And it was amazing because like, as I started to get better, I would have these pots and I'd be like, is this good enough to put her image on, And that's really where this rationale behind putting the portraits that I do on pottery is like, I noticed that throughout history, the history that we were being taught in school, people of color were not, we were also not being taught about the makers, African pottery, South American pottery, Middle Eastern pottery. None of those things were taught. All the pottery we're taught was about Asia and Europe. And so I wanted to take a lot of those tropes and then I wanted to make it so that I could communicate with that audience, like a sort of ceramic art history audience. But then I wanted to connect with the people from where I come from and, put images that they understand, like the graffiti I grew up doing, or like the colors that I fall in love with like African textiles and indigenous textiles from Puerto Rico. And so I started to like find myself in this place where I can create these hybrids and almost like create a conversation amongst cultures within my pottery.
I love it. It's amazing. And here's another one you probably didn't know I was gonna throw in here, but I had to.
Love
Because
it.
I want folks to get a full sense of everything that you do and how brilliant it is. And so I understand this was a commission for a museum in New Orleans.
Yeah. So the pieces on top of the pedestals, like the trumpet is ceramic, and the cross and the chains. So all those are ceramic, and the forms are inspired by Sèvres porcelain, which is a royal porcelain manufacturer from France. And this is sort of like the gilded gold and blue look that they're really known for. So I thought about this relationship to New Orleans and being colonized and like French speaking, and so I wanted to like choose a French porcelain manufacturer, and then I wanted to like highlight figures that from my neighborhood that would have been like easily recognizable as being New Orleans, so Lil Wayne, Louis Armstrong, and then the tank in the middle is from No Limit Soldiers, with Master P. And what's amazing about this piece being in the New Orleans Museum is it's literally functioning in the way that I designed it. Like, people go to the museum and they don't understand the ceramic component to it.
Mm-hmm.
But they see the figures and they dig it just for the aesthetics of it, but then also the people that I'm drawing on it. And then you have other people who totally get the history of the porcelain, but don't know. Most of them know who Louis Armstrong is, but most of them don't know who Lil Wayne is. And very few of them get the reference to No Limit Soldiers with the gold tank in the middle of it. And then the pedestals here are influenced by, in graffiti, there's a lot of this layering of paint over years and years and years. And when you paint something, often the city will cover it up. And what I find is amazing is like a lot of the graffiti is covered up, but a lot of the trash in the city's not covered up. A lot of the failures of police are not taken care of. All these things that we could be putting resources into to fix and support communities. Instead, we cover up graffiti. And I think a large part of that has to do with the fact that it's a threat, that people have the autonomy to have their voices heard, and they're not waiting or asking for your permission. They're just like immediately applying whatever their ideas are. So over the years, if you scratch through that paint, you'll get sort of this texture that's at the bottom. And the cracking and increasing that's happening is highlighted by gold, which is a Japanese technique called kintsugi, which is to repair something with gold. And what I really like of repair a ceramic object with gold, and what I really like about that is to sort of like putting meaning over money. Like this pot is so meaningful to me that the only true way to repair this is to fill it with gold, to sort of show its importance to me.
That's amazing.
But, yeah, and in New Orleans, they're saying, I just had a conversation with the curator and the people there, and they're saying that this is a piece that gathers a lot of conversation and that people are really excited about. And one of my favorite things, sorry if I'm rambling, but one of my favorite things is being in conversation with the security that works at museums. One of the things that I've found is, most of the staff at museums, being security and door people and front desk workers, are often, people of color. And then the curators and the artists are often white. And so when I visit these places, I was a security guard myself at a museum. And, one of the things that was one of my first jobs out of high school was I was a doorman, and it was really close to the Art Museum in Philadelphia, and I would walk over to the Art Museum at lunch and just sit on the steps. And one time I went up and I was like, maybe this museum's free. And I went in, it was like $20. I said, I'm never going to go to this museum. And what was amazing about that is now that I have a piece in that museum, it's this like full circle moment where like I couldn't afford to go in there, and that signaled to me that this place is not for me. And then being a security guard and watching over somebody else's work, and seeing the conversations that were happening there versus like when I have this piece in the museum and talking to the security guards and saying like, you don't understand like what this piece is finally giving me something to be really proud of, and it's giving me something to talk about and something where I can tell people things about it rather than them having to tell me about it, So
I love it. It's almost like it is graffiti because you're and in some ways kind of taking over, infiltrating, even though I'm sure the museum commission didn't buy it, but the approach is almost not asking for permission and speaking a language that the majority of museum visitors may not understand, but you're saying you're speaking to those frontline staff and folks who really get it, who really get the culture.
Yeah, I mean, in a large part, that's who I make artwork for, because some time ago I figured out that, I could that like me trying to sell my work, cups, pottery, functional things, to neighborhoods like I grew up in, isn't necessarily the right approach or the best way for me to make impact, because owning artwork is just one way to interact with artwork. But also for me to push a culture, an ideology, a philosophy that's not from that community, and say, look, you need this, like you need pottery, you need handmade stuff, because I'm better than you now that I know all these things. I think that a better way to communicate is to foster more artists and give people access to be makers themselves, to represent them in the work that I'm making, and then also to put work in their hands. So, a big part of my studio practice is I do donate a lot of my work to people of color, especially people going to school for the visual arts. I also, every month I do a cup sale where I feature a person of color, and knowing what organizations they support, I donate a large portion of those proceeds to an organization that is in line with that person's mission and drive. And so it's this thing where even though I do have these museum commissions, the center and most important part of my work is the direct communication with the community and continuing to be involved. And hopefully I can retire from that. I mean, hopefully there'll be, I can help foster more artists to have those voices, and I can just be one of many. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of, diasporan artists working in ceramics. There just isn't.
For sure. That's definitely true. This is a piece that I pulled because I love it. I love, for me at least, being in a museum, I immediately noticed the themes from Asia, and it looks like some Japanese and Chinese with the blueware, and then the Greek. But then you've also got cash across the chest, and I love the mashup within that. And you've also got some other themes going on in there. You've almost got the Olympic runner. However, there's something else going on in here that speaks of this moment, really.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting how as an artist you make work and it also like changes meaning over time. I don't think that at the time there was as strong a movement as Black Lives Matter, meaning like it was happening, but there wasn't as big of a push as there has been in 2020. But it's something that's always on my mind. I think partially because of my experiences and being so close to being, like one of the things that I share with people is when I was an undergraduate, I drove from Kansas City to Florida for the holidays. And as we were passing the Georgia border, a patrol car came on and they were driving past me. I was going 10 miles under the speed limit. And then they looked in the car. And as soon as they saw me, slowed down, got in back of me, and then followed me for 10 miles. And I made sure that I didn't break any laws. And I also had everything. So they pulled me over, asked me to get out of the car, put my hands on the hood, and asked me to search my car. And I wind up finding myself on the gravel floor. And I asked them why they wanted to search my car. And they said, "You're denying us a search." They already had a K9 unit. And after everything's said and done, I'm like looking up and I see Savannah, Macon, Georgia has the biggest Confederate flag in the country. And it was sort of like a, how dare you cross into our part of the world sort of thing. And at the end of it, I had been so accustomed to this that I felt comfortable enough because my white partner was in the car with me, and she was arguing with the police officers. She was saying, "I know why y'all pulled him over. I know why y'all pulled him over." She was basically calling them racist, literally. And so at the end of the day, I asked them if they wanted to see what, because they were asking me what's in the car because I had all these boxes, and I said, "I make pottery." And I said, "Can I show you some of my pottery?" And they said, the one officer said, "Yeah." And I showed him, I was very specific, even though they broke a lot of my pottery. I was very specific in showing them a cup with me on it. And it was a self-portrait. And, because I thought, what better way to show them that it's me making the pot than to show them a pot with my face on it. And he just sort of smirked and didn't make a comment and got back in his car. This is already at the point where they decided to release me. So during that whole experience, it was like I was terrified for my life, because I said, if I flinch in any way, if I say something that's vaguely threatening, if I do anything at this point, I'm dead, which is like not a good feeling for any human being. And so those things like follow you in everything that you do. And so when I saw this orange, when I see orange and black in pottery, it's this reference to Greek pottery, but it's amazing how, depending on our experiences, we can see the same colors and get an entirely different connotation. Like I see a prison uniform, and it affects me in an entirely different way. And so, this is a series of just like prints that I made, exploring that and sort of like showing the connections between the patterns that that Greek pottery and blue and white pottery sort of like have on me.
I love it. I'm gonna skip this one because we're running out of. I'm always running out of time, but I just want to let the audience know. Yeah, we're gonna go like 75 minutes today. So if you will start entering your questions in the Q&A, we will definitely get to them. I promise you. But I definitely want to get through some of the pieces that I am super excited. I think we're still back in time with this. This one's with 2015, I think.
Yeah.
2015, or is it 2017? Yeah. I know it's a few years ago, but yeah, this idea of you creating this bust of yourself, as the busts. I think we've talked about them a lot in the museum, and how they're for important people, they're for people with power and influence, and usually they're not for someone who comes from an urban community, who listens to hip hop and has graffiti tattoos on their head. So I'm really interested in that, and I think so much of your work is about these conversations with power. Whether it be the police, whether it be more unseen forms of power within society. And yeah, was that your idea with exploring busts and
Yeah, I mean, it's a sort of sculptural representation of what I'm doing with my pottery, is sort of like taking these images that you're accustomed to seeing in a museum or in the home of someone who's wealthy, who can afford to commission a bust. And, you know, we're accustomed to seeing it with like a Ben Franklin or George Washington or some other sort of like historical figure. But most often it's a white person. And I just think it's really interesting, the sort of like gaudiness of a like Louis V's portrait. But then I also think that like hip hop and it's sort of like bling culture and it's sort of like references to like stunting and you know it's often a vulgar display of wealth, but it's seen one way when you're black and brown, but it's seen a different way when you're royalty, like you're okay to
mhm.
wear this big diamond ring, but like and so I kind of wanted to like uh you know have myself in this image of like what would my style look like if I was a wealthy aristocrat. Sort of this combination of like Wu-Tang Clan and Louis Vuitton. I don't know what I was thinking.
I mean, I love it. It's gorgeous. It's a beautiful piece. And yeah, and I love the insertion of hip hop culture into something that normally would not include that at all.
Right.
And then I think then this moves up and this piece. I mean, obviously, the image of who is on the front. Everyone, I don't know where you've been. You've been under a rock if you don't know who this is. On the represented within this form. And I think I know the title is really long. It's hard.
You know how
To
hard it is to get a black man through high
There you
school.
go.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's one of the first things that Mike Brown's mom said when she saw her son uh, killed. And that really hit home to me when I found that out, because uh, it is really difficult for mothers of men of color to be able to get them through high school, and I mean obviously through all your children, but there's often like this different kind of expectation. You know, when I was a freshman in high school, I got declined from every high school I applied to. I got declined to high school
For high school.
for high school, and they sent me to a community school, which is where they send people who, like, if you have a child and you're a teenager and you want daycare, or if you were got out of juvenile detention and you needed a high school. So anyway, I had a friend of mine who was stabbed my first year, and we had to wear badges all day, and they used to like randomly check our tongues for razors, and it was just a really hard school. I remember one day we went in and the teacher gave us a textbook, and all these schools are trained for hospitality, meaning like you're going to serve somebody else. That's what you're trained to do. So she gave us a textbook and she said, just write down what's in this book. So if anybody looks in here, it looks like you're doing something. So I applied that year to go to a different high school, obviously. And my mom went at the end of the year and she said, I don't understand how my son didn't get into any other high school, because he's smart and he's a good person. And I just don't understand why. I know so many kids that don't work as hard as him. And the school district did an audit and they found out that my counselor never sent any of my applications to any high school. And I was lucky enough to have a mom. Like, it was hard for her to get a day off of work to come and do this. But that resonated with me because it was like so much more of a burden placed on women of color. You know, like they have to be everything. And just to have that happen to her was just, I just couldn't imagine. And you know, when I saw this image of Mike Brown and her saying, you know, how hard it is to get through high school, once I was drawing an image of Mike Brown, and there's this thing that happens to artists where you kind of like fall asleep and you wake up and you realize that you've been working, you've been like actively doing something.
Getting
And
in
I
the
drew
zone.
yeah, I drew a portrait and I said, oh man, I accidentally drew a portrait of myself again. And what it was like that the basic outline that I had on the object reminded me of myself, but it was actually the image of Mike Brown that I was drawing, that I hadn't gotten to detail. And so what I did with this piece is actually life size, so it's meant for my entire body to fit inside of. I actually traced the shape of my entire body. So that's why this form is sort of like more organic. You can see my shoulders and head on here. So I traced my body and then I sculpted this pot to fit that form in order to sort of talk about this relationship between the urn and the person inside of it, and how someone like Mike Brown was on the news and people were protesting it, and then he's gone, and his image and memory is gone. And so I wanted to create a ceramic object to keep his memory alive, because ceramic lasts thousands of years. And my hope is for like my ceramics to be used as a tool to keep a conversation going long after it's out of the news cycle.
Yeah, I mean, that leads me to a question of how do you choose the subjects that you memorialize or immortalize within your ceramic? I mean, I'm not gonna show it all within the conversation just because of time limitations, but I mean, you've recently done one of Kamala Harris. You've done one of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. As you said, you've had Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and then more recently, Slick Rick makes his way onto a teapot. So, what is your process for choosing the subjects?
Well, honestly, I don't really think about. I mean, some of them I have to think of ahead of time, like this pot with Mike Brown, but a lot of time I'm responding to the world that I live in, and there's little things that happen. Like, for example, when I ride to work every day, I have my studio in the neighborhood that I grew up in, and I see lines of people wrapped around a corner waiting for food, and then that will inspire this idea of who out there has been talking about food justice since the civil rights movement. And then I'll feature a figure that does that when and so, like, for example, here's a great example. This particular piece was at Design Miami a few years ago, and this is the highest end really design fair in the country. And I wanted to, when I moved back to Philly, I started to see these street shrines that happen where when somebody's shot on the street, people will bring teddy bears and all these things. And those sites are ephemeral. They don't last forever. And so I said, well, how can I make a permanent version of that in ceramic? So I wanted to make a street shrine. But here's the thing, I'm bringing this to a design audience, right? So how do I contextualize that? I chose two of the most iconic figures who died of gun violence in hip hop, Biggie Smalls and Tupac, and then Martin Luther King behind them. To, like a lot of people still didn't even know who these people were, except for like the Black folks, the younger folks, like even if they're not into hip hop, they still understood the images, right? But then the other people got the forms and the pottery and the references. And so it was just like really interesting clashing of cultures. But like the idea when I choose these figures is usually in response to a prompt, like when I had the New Orleans Museum or when I had the High Museum commission me to make a century vase. I'm usually responding to something that's happening in the world that I feel like inspired to make work in response to.
I love it. And yeah, I just wanted to do a little bit of a close up on the teddy bear, and again, it's bringing it's bringing the we have street shrines here in Oakland. There's one actually on my corner right now, and so it's something that we're familiar with, and for you to bring it into this context is just so amazing to me every time. And here's the Slick Rick teapot that I definitely wanted to show for everyone.
Well, I mean, I can say a lot about Slick Rick, but I think the one of the amazing things about some of the earlier hip hop artists is how much of their sound influences contemporary hip hop, and how few young like connoisseurs of hip hop understand where these sounds are coming from. Like entire songs are made off of like one line that Slick Rick said in passing, you know? And one of the things that I try to do is connect. Like for example, recently I did a piece with Kendrick Lamar and Gwendolyn Brooks when Kendrick won a Pulitzer, and it was like I applaud and I love Kendrick Lamar's music, and I was glad to see him win that. But I also wanted to remind people that Gwendolyn Brooks, a poet, a woman poet, won a Pulitzer, decades ago. And I want them to know about her in the same way they know about Kendrick Lamar. And so being able to put them both on a pot to connect those two things, I think is sort of like an example of what I'm trying to do with my art.
I love it. I love it. On this one also, I noticed you've got REM on there. So this is kind of like a question. And I've kind of noticed REM was a trend now. As a kid who was growing up in the 90s myself. Are you talking about the band REM or what is that about?
Well, even though I do love the band REM, which is something we can get into, because I used to listen to a lot of alternative rock as a kid. And I don't know if this happened to you, but every time I would listen to anything other than hip hop, my brother would just be like, "What you trying to be white? Why are you trying to be white?"
Exactly.
So it was kind of like a shame thing, you know. But no, the names that I usually put on my pottery are all the people who taught me how to do graffiti. Which is really interesting because like, none of them are involved in graffiti, and actually like most of them are my cousins, and we're not really like in contact anymore. They're all sort of like hermits. But yeah, like all their names are on my pottery, from Rem to Cello to my brother Maz. And it's sort of like this constant celebration of them, even if they don't see it and they don't know it. That's what I'm trying to do.
That's amazing. And then, also kind of at the center of this, the blue and white motif looks like something that I would see in textiles from the continent of Africa, and even in some of the ancient wares. Is that intentional, or am I making crazy connections?
No, it actually is totally relevant. I mean, when I have, unfortunately, I've never been able to go to the continent. But when I have friends that come back from Ghana, when I have friends could come back from all these different places, I ask them to bring me textiles, or just like images of textiles, or like what the colors look like, or what, so I constantly have all these images in my studio of things that like maybe people aren't accustomed to here, but are like influential into design and how we put things together. So it's a combination of that, and yes, the sort of Chinese porcelain that I'm referencing in a lot of my work.
Awesome. I'm gonna go definitely and bring our audience into the conversation. So I'm really glad to see Soraya Rios is here, and this is, I guess, more of a comment that as a Black mother of a son, your story brings her closer to tears. Brings her close to tears. It resonates with her experiences with her own son growing up. So I really wanted to read that piece for you. And I totally agree. I mean, I think just so much, like, we grew up on opposite sides of the country. But before we talked about, before we started the live, I talked to you about how I grew up in East Oakland, and so much of my own experiences are, based on that experience, even though now I'm not, in East Oakland anymore. You have certain experiences that when you grow up as a man of color in particular, or as a person of color, in an urban environment, that no matter where you are, that experience resonates and it speaks. And so, I've also found myself of just like, yeah, I've been pulled over by the cops. I've been followed by, for miles, when I knew I wasn't speeding. I didn't do anything illegal. And, that story is not just yours or mine. It's so many people's. And I think, the way that you capture it in your work, it just resonates with us who've had that experience and have had those fears, have had to contend with the way that society remains.
Yeah, and I think that's that's really the center of it all. I mean, I think a lot of times when we discuss some of the issues, I mean, it's not just the police brutality; it's the everyday sort of day in and day out, like what where I live in my neighborhood, like, even though people seem friendly and all those things, like when the election happened, I put my Joe Biden sign and my Black Lives Matter sign. I was like, I don't know if people want to try to ransack my house, if they lose. And like whenever I have a question for like a neighbor, I'll always ask I never feel comfortable knocking on anybody's house ever, because I say to myself, somebody could easily shoot me and just be like, well, I thought he was a threat, and things like when I go to a bank and they don't trust me, to cash in the check, but I send my wife in with the same check, they cash in no problem. And as soon as they hear your voice, it's almost like I have to code switch on the phone to get people to help me and not see me as a threat or ignorant or whatever other stereotypes they have of me. It's this constant thing that we have, is people of color, where it affects our daily lives in a way that like we can't sit down and explain to other people who don't go through it, because it would take the whole day.
Exactly.
Every day. So it's, for me, one of the most rewarding parts of being an artist is that I have found community. I'm especially grateful for you folks inviting me to this, because as a kid growing up in Philly, I was Puerto Rican, but most of my Black friends, just thought of me as another Black person, and my Puerto Rican friends, Puerto Rican people didn't think I was Puerto Rican enough to hang out with them. And then white people certainly didn't want to be around me. And so I grew up feeling like really racially ambiguous, and what's amazing is wherever I've gone, I just feel like I have family everywhere because of the Black community in the country. It just seems like there's always a door open, always people like letting me in and including me. And, whenever I feel insecure about my race, whenever I feel insecure about the autonomy that I have, it's just amazing how my Black family always lifts me up, and always like they know that I have that feeling, because imposter syndrome is something that we're taught and is in our DNA. And so they're look, like you are doing what you're supposed to, like you are included, you are welcome, you are part of us, and that's why I made this piece a few pieces ago, where it was a self-portrait with all these parts of me painted, because when I did my DNA study and I found that I'm like 40% African, I showed most of my family, and they were like in denial, like not my immediate family, but my cousins and stuff. They're like, because to be Puerto Rican, they think you're Spanish, and it's like, no. Actually, those are just the people that colonized us. Think about what you eat in your culture and what music you listen to. All these things are influenced by our ancestors from Africa, and so it's just like, for me, that's part of the anxiety that I have making a lot of the work that I do, because it's just this constant worry as to whether or not I should make the work that I do, but it's like, if I'm making the work that I do, all I want to do at the end of the day is create more opportunities for more diasporan peoples to be able to be involved in the arts and be involved in anything they want to do, So that's really in large part of my mission, but also a product of being included and supported by a community of Black and brown people all over the country who have like extended arms and fully supported me. Like one of my proudest moment isn't having a piece in this museum or that museum, is having a piece at the National Museum of African American culture.
Mm.
That was the moment where when I had that piece, I said I could die tomorrow and I'd be happy. That's all I wanted, was that. Because for me, that meant that like the folks who have given me voice, the folks who fought for me to be free, like I have done something worthy of being recognized by them. And for me, that was enough.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I just want to say that we definitely need you to continue to do what you do. It is amazing. It brings so much joy, so much life, and so much voice to those who don't have it. So yeah, I hope the imposter syndrome doesn't make you stop doing what you're doing. It just, for me, it's just like to see folks that are living legends and idols, and even those who are not being placed on these ceramic vessels is just so powerful. And it just breaks down the whole idea, that ceramics are not for us, and I think it's something similar to like Toyin Oji Odutola placing ceramic tea sets inside of, or porcelain tea sets inside of, some of her paintings, and also just kind of giving us a sense of like, we can be this also. This culture is also for us. And like you said, going back to who really made those back in the day, it was our ancestors that were making them. Maybe they weren't using it except for to serve someone else. But you're bringing that back to the community. I guess kind of one of the things I want to end on with you is what's next for you. Can you tell us where we can see next your next pieces? Are there going to be digital exhibitions, or do we have to wait?
There is a couple of projects. One of them I unfortunately can't talk about in public, but it's the biggest project that I'm working on, and it's going to be working with one of the great things that I've had an opportunity to do was I was a part of a symposium that was on the subject of Seneca Village in New York City, and sort of this history of the middle class Black Americans who were expelled from their home. And so I get to work with another artist in response to that. And so that should be announced pretty soon. And then I'm also working on an exhibition with the Currier Museum in New Hampshire. And one of the things that I really want to do is I don't want to just like pick like big cities to do my work in. I want to pick all different kinds of museums or educational institutions, because I think it's important to be in conversation with all different kinds of Americans to sort of like confuse and complicate what stereotypes they have of what someone like me makes. And so I'm actually working on like a functional series of pottery that's really inspired by like American studio pottery, in addition to like what I'm deeming is hood craft, kind of like this patterns of graffiti and images from where I'm from.
I love that. And so what's the best way for folks to follow you and to find out, what's new? Do you have a is it better for folks to go through social media? Is there newsletters they can sign up for?
Yeah. My best is my Instagram. It's Roberto Lugo without wax. And without wax is how my brother used to sign his letters to me when he used to write me from prison. And it means with all sincerity, but it's something he learned in there, because it was like how sculptors used to sign their name to say, I made this without wax. And so for me, it's a sign of authenticity, that I don't just share all of the accomplishments. I also share all of my struggles in the hopes that like other people will find support in that.
That is beautiful. And today, thank you so much for putting all those links in the chat for folks. And we'll also have that on the we'll also put those on the Facebook as well. And I know there's probably more of you on Facebook than on Zoom with us today. I couldn't do both screens, so I hope there's not questions that we didn't get to on there. But yeah, this has been fantastic. Roberto, you are a hero of mine. And you know, I just love what you do. It brings me so much inspiration. And I'm really excited to see what you do next, and hopefully meet you in real life after this whole pandemic is past us.
All right, well, Dimitri, you got to make me one promise then. You got to send me a picture of you that I could draw and I can put on a cup, and then I'm gonna send it to you, okay?
Oh, I would love that. I'm all over it.
I'm gonna put a picture of you on one side and then a picture of me on the other side. That way, you want to look at me, you can.
I'll drink that every day. I'll drink with that every day. I
Please,
love
don't
it.
be serious. Do that, and I promise you, I will send you something because
I will come through. I will come through. Thank you so much, Roberto. I just want everyone to know, if you joined us late, this conversation is being streamed on Facebook, and so it will be immediately available on Facebook after, and by the end of the week, we'll have it on YouTube. You can also go to YouTube, look for Museum of the African Diaspora under YouTube, and you can look at the whole series we've been doing since April. And please join us next week. We will be in conversation with Albert Chong. Really looking forward to that one. Roberto, this has been phenomenal. Thank you so much. Peace and blessings, brother.
Same to you. Bye, everybody. Thank you for hanging out with us.
All right. I'll see you soon.
I'll see you soon.